Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today, I'm joined by Margo Diewald, a trusted advisor who's led the communication strategy and execution behind high-stakes transitions, transactions, and transformations, including more than 25 deals and 3 IPOs. Today, she's the managing director of Adeptation, where her work spans M&A and divestiture communications, new entity stand-ups, and tech-enabled transformation across complex multi-system environments. In this episode, we're going to dig into what M&A communications really looks like when the organization is moving fast, the plan changes midstream, and HR, IT, and communications have to operate as one team. Margo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Clint.
Well, I am really excited to have you here. We've had a couple of really good conversations about your approach to communication, and I've been really impressed. But before we dig into all of that, what got you into M&A work to start with, and what kept you in this space once you saw the fun that happens inside a lot of deals?
Fun is a great way to put it. So what drew me in initially was my very first employer after college was acquired by a PE consortium, then went through a merger of equals. So I started in marketing operations, moved over to a role in sales ops, and we were actively doing the post-merger integration of the company's CRM systems. I was responsible for driving the integration of our commercial reporting capability. Everything from business requirements, user acceptance testing, and being very hands-on in the process of resolving any issues that came up as we were integrating the two systems and ultimately the two sales teams together.
I find it interesting when people get into this space that have lived through a merger, it tends to change their perspective on the overall M&A process because you've had to live with the consequences of it. How do you think living through that merger so early in your career has shaped your approach to this work?
A great question. So the first one I would want to point out is the systems piece. That I was one of 2 people in the entire organization who had unrestricted access to our CRM system, and to give you context and for your listeners, this was before Salesforce had taken over the world. We were actually introducing Salesforce later. So our CRM system was functionally our ERP.
Okay.
For the company I was working for at the time. It's incredibly complex with 2 instances of ostensibly the same system, but different business rules, different processes, different customizations. And what that imprinted on me is, first of all, with that unrestricted access, how information flows through a business. And then where everything that gets overlooked somewhere upstream shows up in one of 2 places, your reporting or your communications.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So I am curious, when we zoom out and you look at the world of communications, because that's our focus today, how do you define great communications? And especially in a way that's really useful for leaders in the integration office, in HR, in IT, those tend to be the 3 places where employees get hit the hardest in my experience.
Got it. Well, it's important for everyone to think about communication is it's not a task. 360-degree communication in M&A is a critical lever of value creation, value protection, and time to value. That means in many cases, the right communications leader is not a pure communicator. They've got to have experience and credibility with every function of the business. Your communications need to be orchestrated and at least somewhat consolidated. When you think about the very human experience of getting emails from HR, emails from IT, emails from your direct report, emails from your finance leader, talking about the new FP&A processes for the new system. There's this very human tendency to get overwhelmed and start to ignore everything, which obviously derails post-deal work streams and delays your time to value. So one of the approaches I take is, how do we integrate? How do we give people a checklist? Here are the things that you need to do as an employee, as a people leader, and as the owner of a process or
Yeah.
the owner of a capability. I also measure differently. I'm not looking at, open rates. I'm not looking for engagement. I'm looking for material reduction in ambiguity and stress among the key teams driving the integration work. And I see you nodding your head, Clint. What
Yeah.
resonated the most with
Yeah.
you there?
So checklists are a really big thing because they're so simple for employees to follow, right? It's I have to do X, Y, Z, and I'm overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information, just like you shared, that
Mhm.
I want to know what do I need to do right now. The thing though, Margo, and I'd love to get your opinion on this. So you shared the idea of 360 communications on the flip side, so we get some employees that are so overwhelmed, it's just tell me what I need to do that's on top of my already crazy job, right? So
Mhm.
you've poured a bunch of extra work on me. What do I need to do to make it simple? And then on the flip side, we get people who are looking for information anywhere they can find it. And so they're going out and looking at the press releases, the leader interviews, any kind of external information that's market facing instead of employee facing to get clues about their future. So I was curious from your perspective how you integrate all of that so that the messaging feels consistent with both what the market is seeing and what the employees are seeing.
Well, flipping it on its head, the way that I advise my clients to think about communications is assume there's one person in your organization that's going to release something internal to the public. So
Okay.
you're over, you're nodding out. This
Yeah.
has happened
Yeah.
more times than I care to share. And that, can be quite stressful if it's 4:30 on a Friday and you get a call from the media and you're just trying to say, "Hey, can you give me till Monday to get on this?" Because of all the other things that are in flight. And so what I think about it is the best communications are integrated to the brand, to the purpose and values. And so there's some overarching message, and it does take a lot of work to distill it down to that, 2 to 4 line statement of, why are we doing this? What does this mean? What's coming? But it's absolutely critical that it's brand integrated.
That
And that
makes
narrative then shapes, that framing shapes everything that we send to leaders, to HR business partners, to employees, to their families who are processing the news about
right.
and their concerns about how this transaction is going to impact their loved ones' continued employment.
Yeah.
I also know from significant firsthand experience that you've got to have top to top communications if you're talking to core business partners like a Fortune 500 retailer. uh, You've got everybody who's on the commercial front line, so they're getting asked daily about this. So you have to have thought about all of that before day one.
Yeah. I really appreciate that you've got this North Star that you create in all of the communications. I think sometimes that ends up missing as we think about different stakeholders in the communications process. And sure, we need to craft the messages, but I have seen them sometimes so disjointed that you're wondering if you're even talking about the same transaction. So I love that you create that North Star.
Thank you.
Yeah. Margo, can you share a specific moment when the reality of the deal forced you to change the communications plan? And what types of decisions do you need to make in those moments when your plan gets derailed?
Uh, I have so many examples. Do you want, one that's global customer facing? Do you want one that's internal? Do you want to hear about what happens when your divestiture is put on pause by external forces?
Well, we don't hear a lot about divestitures on the podcast. We talk a lot about acquisitions. So I'd love to hear a divestiture story.
Okay, well, so let me set the context. January 2020, I was brought in as an interim communications leader to support the separation and spinoff of a global public company.
January
So,
2020, that sounds like something big may have happened right after that.
exactly. So we
Yeah.
were gearing up for spring IPO, and we all know what happened in March 2020.
Yeah.
We, amazingly, I had, I should say serendipitously, I had a conversation with a young person that I had mentored through some of their digital marketing classes when they were here in the States. And he's back in Italy, shared with me, Margo, I'm scared. My family is thinking of closing the medical clinics.
Hmm.
And I hadn't heard anything about coronavirus at that point in time. There was nothing in the press. This is February 2020. But I didn't listen to his message so much as I listened to the feeling behind it. And the idea that his family would shut down their medical clinics
Mhm.
told me I need to look into this. And I did a little bit of research and I saw something that scared me, something that told me I needed to take this very seriously. Called up my husband, who works in healthcare, by the way, and said, we need to, plan for this. And so that way, when, as things were unfolding in early March 2020, um, I was not only, ready for myself, but I was prepared to be the backbone of the leadership team of an organization. Because what ultimately happened over the next the IPO was clearly put on hold because of the stock market swooned in spring 2020.
Right.
We had to stay in hurry up and wait mode for 6 months. We needed to reassure not only the employees that were directly affected, but even the leaders who had
Mhm.
left good jobs. They were prepared to go become senior VP of their function in Newco. Their old role had been backfilled, and they were at risk of not having that leadership level job at a world class company. So we needed to find a way to communicate through all of that noise that yes, Newco is going to go forward. And it was a matter of, well, how can we? And a lot of people think about in those environments, oh, well, we can't say this because people will feel this way. We can't
Right.
say that. And I'm like, well, what can we say? What is the story? And so we ended up creating a couple of articles telling the story of the boring but important work, right? But telling a teamwork story, a values related teamwork story about here's all of the work that the parent company and new company IT teams are doing to make Newco a reality. Here's all of the work that the strategic sourcing team is doing to replicate all of contracts globally for Newco. Here's what's happening. Those are pieces of the story that aren't typically highlighted in any sort of a carve out or a divestiture, but we had to highlight because we needed to reassure the entire organization this will happen. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, that sounds like a really, yeah, I mean, a scary time indeed, but it sounds like you took full advantage of it by giving people at least some information that you could share through the process. So, thinking about that, going back to your idea of a North Star and obviously needing to be able to pivot, when you're building a communications plan for a merger, a carve out, a spin,
Mhm.
what is the very first decision you make? What is the thing that shapes your approach to the communications plan?
The first decision is how does our timeline shape our communication style and pace? A lot of HR leaders, and especially HR business partners who are frontline with the different operating teams, they like gentle, they like measured.
Yeah.
But when key integration or separation work streams are red and you're staring at tens of millions of dollars in fees for missing your TSA exit dates, which for anybody who's listening and hasn't heard the term TSA, that's
Yeah.
your transition services agreement. You need to shake the tree. You need to allow your communicator to shake the tree. The second, and then the first question I ask is what are the communications mechanisms in place that can reach 100% of global associates? And to what extent do the tools at my disposal dictate a batch and blast or a segmented approach? Because that's going to change what's actually in the communication.
Right.
To know, can I send this just to people at this operating company, just the people who speak this language, just the people who live in this country? Because if I can't segment, I have to communicate differently.
That's a really good point. You also said something early on, Margo, that I want to push on a little bit. So you talked about how a lot of folks in HR want to keep things really calm, and I'm curious because in my experience, I think sometimes we can be too calm. Right? This is a big deal for employees. It's a big deal for leaders. whether it's a divestiture or an acquisition, whether it's a spin, something is happening to people's jobs and people's lives. And I think sometimes when we're too calm, it can land as tone deaf. So I'm curious about how you manage the tone of the messaging when you mentioned shake the tree, but how do you do that without creating panic? Like what's the happy medium and how do you get there?
Okay, great. So one of the PE operators that I respect a lot for the work that we did, he brought me in a week before day one on a particular transaction. And thankfully that was only a 100-person organization, but they still had 3 sites.
Okay.
And, he expressed it as there's a line between um, like panic and overwhelm or something like that. I'm trying to think of the exact words he used. It's like there's pressure and there's overwhelm. And you don't want people overwhelmed or shutting down because that's counterproductive. So the tone, a lot of it, in one situation might be, hey, like I'm always thinking about how do I lay the groundwork to prime the entire organization that change is coming. I don't know what the changes are, but I've never been part of a transaction that was not immediately followed by, various types of change, whether that's new systems, a reorg, a voluntary separation plan. I don't need to know the details. I know that change is coming. I need to shift the tone of all communications ahead of whatever I'm about to be read in on so that we're respectful of the associates and of the leaders whose careers will be impacted, whose day to day work will be impacted, so that they know, okay, change is coming. Generally, it's a good thing. Here are some tools you can use to be prepared. We also know through experience that people tend not to act until the sixth or seventh communication they've received.
Right.
Sometimes they don't act until their direct manager tells them to take action. So, there was another scenario. We were, I was brought in by the CIO and the IT portfolio leader as a carve out. And along with this brands only carve out was a shift to all new systems fully in the cloud. So not only were they becoming a new entity, the business needed to map every single business process and workflow because they were going to have a new ERP, a new HRIS, a new time and expense system, new payroll, everything. And no one in the business was sort of acting like they got that. So when I came in, I was, okay, we're 5 months out from this split. I need to have communications up and running within a week. So now before you ask what that looked like, I said, all right, I've got to build a communications hub. I've done this in different environments. It might be a microsite if it's external. It could be built on SharePoint if the intranet already exists or staff base or whatever they use. Or it could be built on Teams. And in this case, like, great, I have to build on Teams, which alleviates me from the graphic design portion of the burden of M&A costs. I said, okay, most people don't go through a full tech stack separation and replication onto new cloud-based systems. What does this mean?
Yeah.
What is UAT? What's requirements gathering? Why do I need to sign off on them? What is user acceptance testing? What training am I accountable for? So we had a comms and training hub. I spun that up in the span of a week. And then the following Monday, started sending out communications against that with links back to the hubs, that central repository where people could access information. And the framing of it very much said, this is what we know today. We will continue adding to this repository. Come and get the information that you need. Because would take us 7 weeks, right, with that weekly cadence to get the full organization aware that change was coming. It was non-negotiable. It was massive in scale, and that there was work that they needed to do at different levels based on their role to be prepared for it.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's making me wonder. You've talked a bit about sequencing a few times. And then just prior to that, we talked about the difference between overwhelm and preparation. I think were the words that you used. How do you decide? And this sounds like a perfect example to share that. How do you decide what people need to know on day one versus later on? I mean, that is a lot of change, and I feel like you could have people drink from the fire hose, or you can trickle. Right there's a pacing and cadence that you've got to sort out. How do you run that process?
So a little bit will depend on the scope of what I'm brought in to communicate for. Am I owning internal comms? Am I owning IT comms? Am I owning global consumer facing comms for the integration of a website? But if it's internal, or if internal is part of my scope, there's certain high level questions that have to be answered day one and again as things progress.
Yeah.
What is happening with my job, my pay, and my benefits? Because I have people depending on me. That must be answered clearly, frequently. And if you're going to punt on some dimension of it, then you commit. If you can't commit to what you're giving them, you commit to when you will give them an update. Then you need to equip people so that they know how to respond to their family, their customers, their business partners, their stakeholders, or even investors when those folks ask questions. And that pressure is most acute for anybody with day-to-day external interactions, such as sales, partnerships, or your HR business partners. I keep a framework in mind for all of it. What do we say? When do we say it? To which audience? Through which channels? And in how much detail? So going back to some of my IT experiences, there was one where we're planning the global integration of two websites. I don't want to name the company because people will be able to figure out. But if you're integrating those public facing consumer websites, we needed to preserve, we're several months out. We didn't want to box IT or the integration management team into a particular date. So it becomes, changes coming in the spring. So maybe in October, we're saying change is coming. It's coming in the spring. Then we're saying change is coming in Q1. As time progresses, change is coming in March. Change is coming first half of March, right? And because you want to progressively get people ready for that information without boxing in your delivery teams. As you probably know as well as I do, something can always go sideways with
Right.
the technology integration.
Right. Or other priorities come and disrupt. I mean, it's really hard to say. Which leads me to another question, Margo. So when you look at communications, especially in M&A, whether it's a separation or an integration or a spin, information's always changing, right? The facts are they're seldom solid. So what kind of operating cadence do you put into place? What works best to keep leaders aligned on messaging when the priorities are changing, when the facts are changing? I mean, I I want to say daily, but often it's several times a day when you're in those last planning sprints.
So again, some of that will be context dependent on what's the size of the organization, and then also what's the size of the internal communications or the corporate communications apparatus that the company
Yeah.
has. I have been in a couple of situations where I was one of a very lean team of 2 or 3 at best. I've been in smaller organizations where I was all of it
Yeah.
and owning everything. So it just came down to Margo is the backbone. And then in other cases, like a consumer organization might have dozens of communicators, but then the challenge becomes the clarity of who owns which piece of the message, who's authorized to send what and when. And that creates a lot of pressure on folks. You have to say maybe they have PR responsibilities for one brand in one piece of the global market. How are you making sure that that person is empowered and knows when they can and can't act?
That makes sense. I'm curious. You've speaking of who can act, who's empowered. I've been in situations where as the HR guy in seat, I've got a difference of opinion with IT. I've got a difference of opinion with legal. I've got a difference of opinion with comms. Now, normally when I'm disagreeing with all three, I got to look at where I am. But my bigger point is that when you have stakeholders who do have disagreements, how do you resolve that? Because each of your stakeholders has got a different perspective, and usually they're valid perspectives, but you've got to get a message out. So, how do you resolve those disagreements without slowing things down?
I'm going to tell you, first of all, this requires a degree of professional vulnerability to be the first person to put something in writing.
Okay.
And I set ground rules with the teams that I'm working with that, look, that I am taking on this professional vulnerability so you don't have to. Uh, and then in exchange, I am asking for all of you to understand that I will hold this message. I will hold this team if it's an important enough communication until we get this resolved, because we can't be passing red lines back and forth for
Mhm.
3 weeks. on something that needs to go out this afternoon at 2 p.m. But in my experience, and this goes back to my early career experience in commercial reporting, where I had exposure to sales leadership, finance, IT, data warehousing, business intelligence, all of it. A lot of disagreements happen because people are talking around the same issue from different altitudes or different functional lenses. And so that sort of the collective experience across all of the transactions I've been a part of and working with all of the different business functions helps me say, okay, here, Clint, this is what you're looking for. I understand why you're asking, and this is valid. Here's maybe an assumption that might change your mind, or here's a question I need to ask to help me shape something. Because oftentimes it's just a matter of perspective in terms of why these groups think they're disagreeing. And that might surprise you, but far more teams are in fundamental alignment. But the other piece in addition to style, or I would say style is the piece that's missing in addition to altitude and functional lens. Sometimes somebody's very high D on a disc profile and they don't like something from someone who's more of an S or a C. And so they're reacting to the other party's style more than they are the actual message.
Well, I feel a little called
And
out
so
there as a high D, by the way, which is dominance, by the way. We can be jerks, just speaking of professional vulnerability, and sometimes have to dial it back. Sorry, Margo, please go ahead.
No, it's all right. Sorry. I realize I talk about DISC, assuming most people at the point in their career that they're listening to an M&A, HR M&A podcast, they've probably done the DISC profile.
Yeah.
And so, and that comes up, but the style differences too. And so, I'm looking as well as the organization can have a style or personality. Do they want to be very measured? Do they want to be very guarded? Are they conscientious about not getting out over their skis? Or are they very market facing? They've got to be forward. They've got to be leading and driving. I take all of that together as some alchemy. And sometimes it's, guys, we have to resolve this one point or I can't press send on this communication. What's it going to be? Everyone has to sign off. And I have held leadership teams on the phone on Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. to say, no one's getting off this call until we're in alignment on this sentence so I can send this communication, and that's okay. Which does lead to a point I've talked about in some of my articles, which is you need a communications leader, not a lead. The bigger the transaction.
Say more about that.
And well, so I talk in certain cases when everything is changing in real time. You need someone who has the gravitas to tell rather than ask what's needed in communications. I'm thinking of a gentleman, we're working on building a new offer that we're bringing to market, but I worked with him a few years back on one of my transactions. And in his situation, he was leading an operating company that was going through a site consolidation. So clearly for most of the folks in this organization, we're going to have roles available to them if they were willing to move. But you and I both know, any HR leader knows not every employee wants to relocate for their work. Right? Because they have family and other commitments in a particular geographic area. I wasn't asking him what he wanted in the communications. I was telling him, here's how I think. Here's how I want to approach this. These are the pieces of information I need from you. Are we in alignment? And what that did was that melted some of the pressure off of him, right? Because he felt seen in the moment. Right? Because he's also thinking, leaders don't experience this in a vacuum. Everybody thinks leaders are invulnerable. He's also feeling a responsibility for his people. Right. He's also thinking about what his own next role will be. But he does have this foundational commitment to take care of the people in his organization and to do right by them. And there's so much going on. And to just take that 30% of the stress off of him by saying, hey, I'm more than a communicator. In this situation, I'm also, a person, a peer. I see you. I see what you need. Here's how I'm approaching the comms. I'm going to work with your HR business partner. I'm going to work with you. Anything else you need, fine. I don't press send till I have your full approval. And interestingly, the communication I had prepared for that site consolidation announcement said somewhere in it, a statement along the lines of, but at least we're keeping jobs in the US. There was a different piece elsewhere in the organization where we were nearshoring.
Okay.
And these two groups are not read in on what's happening in each other's organization. But I, as lead communicator or as communications leader, was read in on both. And I had to know, and I should say, I had to be authorized in that situation to just take the one statement out without even telling anybody. It was like, yeah, okay, this communication goes out today. The other one's prepping for next week. But I have to take that sentence about keeping jobs in the States out of this comm because the following week's comm would undermine it. And it affects trust across the entire organization, not just those who are directly affected.
Yeah. So, Margo, what are the most common unforced errors you see in M&A comms, especially in the first 30 to 60 days after close?
Great question, Clint. The most common source of unforced errors is customer-facing individual who goes rogue. But more generally, why unforced errors come about is because there's no clear owner of M&A communications who's read in on all the details of different initiatives in flight and exercises the discipline and discretion around how information is shared within and across those initiatives.
So, I'm curious because I know quite a few comms people, and what really struck me was your point earlier about getting read in like a week beforehand. In HR, we see that a lot too, right? You've got to give us enough time to do our jobs and to do it well, given our scope. How often is that a problem in comms? Are you typically brought in very, very late in the process? Are you brought in early? Is there a difference in the quality of the work that you can do? Like, where's that sweet spot between prepping for something that may not go through if the deal doesn't get signed and not having enough time to do your work?
Ultimately, this comes down to budget. The longer you delay, the more you need to spend to get an expert M&A communicator who can plug in a week before day one and pick up and use all of their corporate experience on your mid-market transaction. Because what tends to happen, Clint, folks like yourself, maybe the person who's putting together the new benefits packages, they've done this painstaking detail to build a like-for-like benefits package. And comms becomes an afterthought because they're bogged down in the
Right.
details of everything else. Similar type of situation happens for IT leaders or finance leaders. And, I might be coming in a week before day one and I'm reading what the HR team has put together or what the finance leaders put together and saying, okay, but, you said this is a core issue, but here's something in the communication that needs to change and why. Right? Like you've got US and Canadian operations. You want to reassure the Canadian employees that, yes, your site will remain open, your jobs will remain in place. But when that cover letter to employees talks about 401ks, you've lost your Canadian team,
Right. Right.
right? Because you need someone who has the experience to just immediately look at that comm and say, but Canadians have our RSPs. We're pulling this out and we're reframing it and talking about your retirement benefits.
Yeah.
Your retirement benefits, sorry.
Yeah, and look, my recommendation for anybody doing a deal that's in more than one country is to have a separate employee comms plan for each country. And sometimes you can reuse artifacts across countries. So maybe there's one overarching message, but that should be general. I don't want to say generic. It should be general to everybody. And then you need country specific comms. You're right. I think that those are lessons that you learn after taking some lumps.
Absolutely. And then when I work with programmatic M&A players, they understand it's the role of your central communicators not to write everything, but to develop the structure, the playbook, the guidance that then enables the communicators in different parts of the world. Because in my experience, a lot of communications teams run lean.
Yeah. So you've got this team of folks that you have deployed that can help make sure that it's culturally competent, that you're using the right language. I think that's really smart. I think in the world of AI, Margo, that there, look, I'm seeing people build full integration plans using ChatGPT, and in fact, when I teach my class at NYU, that's something I have the students do. But then I have them interrogate the plan. I think, and they start to see the holes in it, right? I think that's the biggest threat to doing this well right now is people who plug into AI. And I think the same thing about translations a lot of times, that sure, it might be technically correct, but you miss a lot of that local nuance. So I think that's very smart to have like actual humans looking at your messaging. Even if you use AI to, I don't know, maybe kickstart it, it just feels like a mistake not to have people in the loop.
There should always be people in the loop, and sometimes too, it's the informal. I mentioned people don't react, or a certain segment of the population doesn't react until they hear something from their direct manager.
Right.
There was one where, it was the total separation and spin of the corporate tech stack. Thankfully, that we were keeping like for likes. Everyone was going to be using the same tool, but there was still a lot of work that had to be done by employees for specific applications to manage to make sure that their data was migrated from the old Microsoft tenant over to the new one. And that, there's only so much I can do through, centralized comms, sending out newsletters, putting things on the internet. There's some old fashioned, let me pick up the phone and call Jordan or Alexa or whoever runs a particular business process or a team and say, I need you to tell all your employees that the email I sent on Thursday at 2 p.m. Yes, they must take this seriously. Here's the implication for your global function if they don't act on it. I hate to do a drive-by like that. So maybe it's 10 minutes, but just, I need you to know that this is important, and I need you to reinforce to your people that this is important.
Right. Well, those cascading messages to get people to take action. Middle managers are the most trusted source of information for most employees, and that's a pretty global reality. And I think a lot of times we forget about their importance as communicators in any kind of change event.
Absolutely. And part of the comms plan includes talking points. So that way, the person who's at the front line, whether that's an HR business partner with employees, or that's an individual sales rep who runs key accounts, or maybe has a long tail of accounts, they need to be equipped with talking points so they can answer with consistency. Because what I find is that in the absence of a mess of knowing what to say, humans ad lib.
Right. Yeah. And it's seldom a good ad lib. I mean, let's be honest. It's all about survival at a certain point. If we're not giving information, people will make up the worst case scenario in their heads. It's what we're genetically wired to do.
Or even if they don't make something up, they might be right in the content of their message, but they're wrong in the delivery of it.
Yeah. So, as we get close to wrapping up our time together, I would love to hear about a specific situation where the alignment among the leadership team broke down and it somehow showed up in how those messages. So, talking about delivery, what happened? We all love a train wreck, so I'd love to just hear a story, and then knowing that your skill level, I'm sure that you played a part in getting that fixed, and that could be a good lesson for people too. How do we fix it when it goes off the rails?
Well, if you want to, do you want a
Oh,
funny story?
please, please.
Okay, so this one's absolute cringe for every HR leader who's listening. I talked about sometimes what goes wrong is that an individual goes rogue. In one of the more surprising cases, the US regional president disclosed sensitive information during an all hands because he thought it was
Oh
funny.
no.
He played a song that, if you understood what the song was, indicated who one of the strategic buyers was that was considering buying a piece of business that was about to be carved out from the company.
Hmm.
And it's the it was the kind of strategic buyer that if you Googled them or you looked up their Glassdoor, you as a US employee would see something alarming and say, no way do I want to be associated with that. And we saw immediate turnover and loss of progress on certain initiatives because of who turned over.
Oof.
I was not the M&A communicator on that one. I was you know, I was leading a piece of things then for, say, the top to top message for external accounts. I did not run the internal comms on that. I wish I would have.
Well, maybe not. I don't know that you want a piece of that. Yeah, it's fascinating. That you're right. That's definitely cringeworthy. So, Margot, for
Yeah.
a company that doesn't have a dedicated M&A comms leader, what is the minimum viable setup that you would recommend they put in place? Because you talked budget earlier. Smaller companies seldom have budget for a lot of them don't have budget for full-time HR, full-time legal, full-time anybody. So when they're bringing in a fractional solution or, trying to set this up and do it well, but on maybe less of a budget than you might like, what are the minimum criteria?
Um, First one would be have an M&A comms playbook
Okay.
for your organization that outlines what are all the layers of communications, because it's so much more than just PR or just internal communications. And if you're and that will help guide who you bring in when you need an interim M&A comms leader. Because otherwise, if you bring somebody who comes from just one of the communications disciplines, they may be over focused on that and then to the exclusion of all of these other topics like the IT piece, the HR piece. Um, I also think it's important, say, for corporate development leaders to understand the work of M&A comms is never MECE. For everybody listening, that's mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. It's not something that lends itself well to a framework. There's always another rabbit hole to go down that requires exploration and resolution. You need an M&A comms leader that can shift altitudes quickly to zoom in and out of different layers of depth in the organization around the issues you're trying to communicate through. And have the name of 3 or 4 people that you could bring on in an interim capacity for key deals. If then too with your And then what that person should know coming in goes back to the playbook. What are the tools? And then who are the individuals who can be tapped as fractional communicators within your existing organization so that they have people to partner with?
Fantastic advice, Margo. So I heard three things there. So I heard have a playbook, understand that you need somebody who can operate at multiple levels, and then have somebody on speed dial. So I think that's fantastic advice. Where can our listeners find you and follow your work once the episode's over?
Clint, I invite your listeners to follow my company Adeptation on LinkedIn and invite me to connect. If there's ever an active transaction, we'll be happy to get a mutual NDA in place prior to our conversations. And if they'd like to learn more about our approach, they should check out Adaptation's recent 3-part article on the intersection of narrative and brand and how we amplify value creation for our clients through M&A communications.
Fantastic. Well, this is the year of value creation at Master Your Merger. So I'm really glad to hear that. And we'll make sure we put links to that article in the show notes. Margo, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks. I agree, Clint. You are a master of value creation.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Klint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.